Taken in rural Carter County, Kentucky, during the bitter winter of 1951, it shows two newborns lying side by side in a wooden crib. A handwritten note on the back reads, Thomas and Sarah Parish, March 14, 1951. At first glance, it's a typical family snapshot, dimly lit, faded at the edges, the kind of picture found in a dusty box of forgotten memories. But if you look closely, it begins to fall apart. The eyes of the infants are too far apart. Their mouths don't close properly. Their fingers, too long and jointless, curl in unnatural ways. The photograph would vanish 3 years later when the family buried it in a metal box behind their barn. They never spoke the twins' names again. Not at Sunday dinner, not in prayer, not even at funerals. By the time reporters came asking questions after what happened in 1958, the Parish twins had already become ghosts in their own bloodline. This is their story, and the story of what came after. The Parish family realized their children had stopped being human. The Parish family had worked the same 200 acres of Kentucky farmland since 1873, 4 generations of quiet, practical people who grew tobacco, attended church, and kept to themselves. There were no secrets then, no scandals, just another rural family surviving the cycles of planting and harvest. In the spring of 1951, Margaret Parish gave birth to twins in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse. She was 30 years old, strong and healthy. The pregnancy had been uneventful. Her husband Robert stood beside the bed, handkerchief crushed in his palm, as the midwife, Ethel Coombs, delivered the first baby, then the second. The house should have filled with joy. Instead, it filled with silence. The birth Ethel Coombs had delivered over 300 babies in her 40 years of practice. But when she saw the Parish twins, she almost ran. The babies were alive, breathing, crying softly, but their bodies were wrong. Thomas's spine was twisted in 3 unnatural places. His legs were different lengths by nearly a foot. Sarah's skull plates hadn't fused, leaving soft spots that pulsed visibly beneath translucent skin. Their eyes moved, but they didn't see. They seemed to track invisible things in the air. When Dr. Howard Brennan, the town physician, arrived the next morning, he examined them in silence for 20 minutes. Then he stood at the kitchen window, looking out over the fog-drenched fields, and said something Robert would never forget. Survival isn't the question you should be asking. The secret that same morning. The Parish family made a decision that would shape their lives for generations. They would keep the twins but tell the world they were stillborn. No hospitals, no visitors, no photographs. They held a fake funeral, 2 tiny empty caskets lowered into the churchyard soil. The community mourned. The Parish twins were officially dead, but upstairs in that shuttered farmhouse they were very much alive. Life in hiding for 7 years, the Parish family lived like prisoners of their own blood. Margaret stopped attending church. Robert turned down every family gathering. The curtains stayed drawn even in summer. Neighbors whispered that grief had driven them strange, but no one pried. In small towns, mourning is sacred. Inside, Margaret's days revolved around the children, feeding them, bathing them, keeping them hidden. She kept a journal written in secret, documenting what no one else would ever see. At first, she described their deformities with clinical precision. But as time passed, her tone shifted from horror to fascination. The twins were learning. Not like normal children, but learning all the same. By age 3, Thomas could drag himself across the floor with his arms. Sarah could sit up when propped with pillows. And together they had begun to communicate, not with words, but with something else. The connection. Margaret wrote that sometimes, late at night, she would find them awake and silent, staring at each other across their shared crib. "It's like they're speaking in a way I can't hear," she wrote. "They look at each other as if sharing thoughts. When separated, they would cry at the exact same time. When one grew feverish, the other's pulse quickened. When Thomas was hurt, Sarah's soft spots throbbed visibly beneath her skin. Dr. Brennan continued his secret visits, always after dark, always parking far down the road. He brought medicines and formulas but avoided conversation. He had stopped pretending to understand what these children were. The fracturing mind. By 1956, Margaret's handwriting in her journal had grown jagged and frantic. "They're teaching each other something," one entry read, "and I don't think they're suffering the way we thought. Whatever the twins were becoming, it was intentional. And the family, trapped in their farmhouse, bound by secrecy, was beginning to realize that they were raising something they couldn't control. The Parish twins had survived against all odds. But what they were becoming would make their parents wish they hadn't. By the winter of 1956, the farmhouse had fallen into complete silence. Curtains never opened. Lamps burned low. The house smelled of milk, antiseptic, and fear. Margaret Parish had stopped singing, stopped writing hymns under her breath while she worked. Even the birds outside seemed to avoid the windows. She hadn't left the property in 6 years. Every creak of the floorboards upstairs made her tense because it meant the twins were awake again. Thomas and Sarah were 7 years old now. They still slept in the same crib, though they no longer fit. Their bodies had grown long and frail, stretching beyond normal proportions. Their eyes never blinked in unison, but when one turned its head, the other followed instantly, and they had begun doing something new. Margaret wrote in her journal, one of the last entries before it turned erratic. They hum now, not songs, not words, just tones. When they do it together, the walls vibrate. I can feel it in my teeth. Robert Parish tried to pretend the sound didn't exist. He spent more time in the fields, working until dusk, even when the ground was frozen. He'd begun drinking quietly, alone in the barn. Then, in January of 1957, Margaret missed her cycle. She knew before any doctor could confirm it. She was pregnant again. The omenit was a cruel miracle. She and Robert hadn't shared a bed for nearly 2 years. When she told him, his face drained of color. "Are you sure?" he asked. She nodded. That night, she wrote a single line in her journal. "Whatever is inside me now feels like it already knows me." From the moment she began to show, the twins changed. They grew restless whenever she entered their room, their pale eyes following the movement of her belly. Sarah's pulse points began throbbing again. Thomas clawed at the walls during her visits, leaving gouges in the plaster. Dr. Brennan was summoned once more. He examined her under the yellow lamplight of the kitchen and said nothing for a long time. Finally, he looked at Robert and murmured, "If you want my professional opinion, end it, now. Whatever this is, it's not ordinary." She might not survive the birth. Robert refused. Margaret wouldn't hear of it. She believed the pregnancy was tied to something sacred, or cursed, in their land. "It began here," she told her husband, "and it must finish here." The growing dread. The summer heat was relentless that year. By August 1957, Margaret was enormous. Her body had changed in ways that unsettled even Dr. Brennan. The child's movements were violent, not soft kicks, but sharp, deliberate strikes that left bruises on her skin. Sometimes when Robert watched her from across the room, he could see the outline of tiny limbs pressing against her stomach, not random, but rhythmic. And always, the twins upstairs would begin their low humming whenever the baby moved. The E sound carried through the floorboards like a heartbeat beneath the house. Dr. Brennan made 2 more visits that summer. The second time, he didn't even unpack his medical bag. He simply told Robert, "I don't think this child will be like the others. It's learning before it's born." The night of the birth, September 9th, 1957, 3 weeks early. Tuesday night. Robert was in the barn when it started. The scream hit him like a shotgun blast echoing across the tobacco fields. By the time he reached the house, Margaret's voice had broken into ragged gasps. Upstairs, the twins were screaming too, the same pitch, the same rhythm. Dr. Brennan arrived 40 minutes later, pale and shaking. He climbed the stairs with trembling hands, hearing the hum of all 3 voices vibrating through the floor. He would tell his wife later that night that it was the worst thing he'd ever witnessed. The baby came at 11:47 p.m. It did not cry, it fought. When Dr. Brennan lifted the infant, its hands clamped onto his wrist with such force that he dropped his instruments. The grip left bruises that wouldn't fade for days. Its eyes, open and fixed, followed his movements, unblinking. Robert stood frozen in the doorway as his wife held the newborn against her chest. For a moment, silence filled the room. Even the twins had gone still. Then the baby turned its head and looked directly at them. Both twins began to hum. Low. Steady. Perfectly in sync. Dr. Brennan whispered under his breath, "God help us." The third child, they named him Daniel, but they did not register his birth. Unlike his brother and sister, Daniel appeared almost normal, symmetrical face, proper limbs, clear eyes. But there was something else, something behind those eyes that didn't belong to a child. By 3 days old, he could hold up his head without help. By 1 week, he followed his mother's every move like a hunter watching prey. And he never cried. Not once. Dr. Brennan, now visibly aged by the ordeal, warned Robert quietly, "Keep him separate from the twins, for all your sakes." When Robert asked why, the doctor struggled to explain. Because the twins aren't waiting anymore. Whatever they were waiting for. It's here now. Margaret's last journal, her final entry before the ink trails off into madness. They're calm now, peaceful. As if they understand something I don't. They lie awake together for hours, eyes closed, but not asleep. And Daniel watches them. Watches us. He never cries, never laughs. I don't think I'm raising children anymore. By the time autumn came, the tobacco leaves outside turned brittle and black. The parish farmhouse grew colder, quieter, and upstairs 3 voices could sometimes be heard, humming in perfect harmony. Not a song, a signal. By the fall of 1958, the parish farmhouse no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place being watched from the inside. The wallpaper upstairs had begun to peel, though Margaret swore it hadn't been from moisture. "It's the air," she told Robert once. "It feels like it's breathing." The twins, now 7 years old, rarely spoke, but their humming had grown constant, layered and rhythmic, as though following a pattern only they could hear. Daniel, now 1 year old, listened with unnerving patience. When the humming stopped, he would look disappointed. Margaret hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night in months. Her journal from this time contains the same line repeated again and again. They're waiting for something. The Halloween incident, October 31st. 1958, a date the parish family would never speak of again. Robert was repairing a broken fence post in the lower pasture when he heard his mother screaming from the farmhouse. Ruth Parish, a woman who'd survived the Great Depression and buried 2 husbands without ever shedding a tear, was shrieking like a child. He dropped his tools and ran. The house was filled with a sound he couldn't identify, a humming that vibrated through his bones. It wasn't loud, but it felt enormous, like it came from inside the walls. When Robert reached the 2nd floor, he found his mother on the landing, white-faced, pointing at the twins' bedroom door. "They're gone," she stammered. "They're not in their beds." He opened the door. The crib was empty, the blankets neatly folded, the air thick and still. Neither twin could walk unaided. Thomas could barely crawl, yet both had vanished. And then Ruth whispered, "They're in his room." The Convergence Daniel's door was slightly open. Light flickered from within, not the flicker of a lamp, but something dim and alive. Inside, the scene froze Robert in place. The 1-year-old sat upright in his cradle, a posture impossible for a child that age. His eyes glowed faintly in the half-light, reflecting like an animal's. On either side of him sat Thomas and Sarah, perfectly balanced, their deformed bodies arranged in impossible positions. Sarah's head lifted straight, her gaze clear and focused for the first time in her life. All 3 children were humming, the same note, the same rhythm. The sound made the glass of the window quiver. When Robert stepped inside, they stopped. Instantly, all 3 turned their heads toward him at the same moment, their movements synchronized with unnatural precision. That was the first time Robert Parish truly understood that his children were no longer human. The doctor's last visit sent Ruth to fetch Dr. Brennan immediately. The old physician arrived just after midnight, exhausted and trembling. He examined the twins, then Daniel. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his stethoscope. Finally, he sat down at the edge of the bed and whispered, "This isn't medicine anymore." Margaret, clutching a blanket around her shoulders, asked what he meant. Dr. Brennan looked at her with eyes full of pity and terror. "They're not sick," he said quietly. "They're becoming something." He didn't elaborate. He just packed his instruments and told Robert, "If you have any faith left, pray. Because no science on earth can explain what's happening in this house." Those were the last words he ever said to them. He drove away in silence and never returned. A year later, he died of a heart attack. His wife burned all his journals, including the entries labeled Parish Family, 1951 to 1958. The aftermath. The morning after Halloween, the twins were silent again. They lay in their crib side by side, eyes open, calm. Daniel sat on the floor between them, drawing patterns in the dust with his fingers, perfect circles that overlapped like rings of a tree. When Margaret tried to wipe them away, Daniel grabbed her wrist and looked at her almost reproachfully. "Don't," he whispered. It was his first word. That was when Margaret knew she could no longer pretend her children were afflicted. They were evolving. The departure by spring of 1959, the family sold the farm. Robert insisted on it. He didn't even negotiate the price. The only condition was that the buyer never enter the upstairs rooms until the family had cleared them out. He spent 3 days boxing Margaret's things, burning her journals in a barrel behind the barn, and dismantling the twins' crib piece by piece. He buried each section in different corners of the property, 6 locations marked only by small stones. On the 3rd night, he woke to the sound of faint humming coming from beneath the floorboards, not from the children's room, but from the earth itself. The next morning he packed the truck. At midnight, the Parish family left Kentucky under a false name and never looked back. But the sound didn't stay buried, even now. Locals say that on cold October nights, when fog covers the fields and the air feels too heavy to breathe, you can still hear it. A low hum from the 2nd-story windows of the abandoned parish farmhouse. 3 voices. Perfect harmony waiting. When the Parish family left Kentucky in March of 1959, they did not look back. They drove west through the night, a single truck loaded with crates, blankets, and 3 silent children. The road was slick with spring rain, the air thick with the smell of wet tobacco and diesel. By dawn, they had crossed into Missouri. By dusk, they had become someone else. A new name in Spokane County, Washington. Robert Parish signed a rental agreement under the name Robert Preston. The house was small, gray, and ordinary, the kind of place no one would notice. That was the point. He told neighbors they'd come from Tennessee seeking work at the lumber mill. They nodded politely. In towns like that, no one pried too much, but the children never went to school. The shade stayed drawn even during the day, and when the wind carried a certain low tone through the pine trees at night, Margaret would tremble and whisper, "They're remembering." Life in the basement. The twins, Thomas and Sarah, were 10 now. Against every medical prediction, they could walk, not well, not naturally. Their movements were too precise, too deliberate, like marionettes tugged by invisible strings. Their voices had deepened but rarely spoke. They communicated mostly through the same low hum that had once haunted the Kentucky farmhouse. Daniel, now 7, was growing faster than humanly possible. His height, strength, and coordination belonged to a teenager, but his face remained that of a boy. He never raised his voice, never smiled, yet when he looked at his siblings, they responded instantly, moving in synchronization like dancers in a silent ritual. Margaret kept them in the basement, a low-ceilinged space lined with shelves and old furniture. She gave them toys, had wooden blocks, marbles, bits of string, and every evening she would find those objects rearranged into patterns she couldn't understand. Circles, triangles, perfect spirals that no child's unsteady hand could have made. Sometimes she'd sweep them away, only to find the same shapes drawn again by morning, this time carved faintly into the concrete with fingernails. The town's quiet curiosity to the neighbors, the Prestons, was strange but harmless. Robert worked long shifts at the lumber mill, rarely speaking at church or local stores. Margaret was almost never seen. When asked about their children, she'd say simply, "They're delicate." A local woman once stopped by with a casserole and claimed she heard singing coming from inside the house. Soft, droning, like monks chanting in a foreign tongue. When she mentioned it later at the market, Robert's eyes went cold. He never let another visitor inside. Robert's breaking point. The pressure of secrecy wore on him. He began hearing things, faint hums under the sound of saws at the mill, whispers in the static of the radio. He told himself it was exhaustion. But one night in 1973, Robert woke to find the house vibrating faintly. Margaret was already standing in the hallway, pale and wide-eyed. "It's them," she whispered. Downstairs, the basement door stood open. When they descended, the air was dense, hot and humming. The three children stood in a perfect circle, facing inward, hands clasped. A faint glow, colorless but visible, pulsed between them. Robert shouted their names. None responded. He tried to step forward, but Margaret grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said. "They're listening." The glow brightened once, then faded. The hum stopped. All three turned toward their parents in unison, eyes reflecting the low lamplight like the surface of still water. "It's learning," Daniel said softly. Then they walked upstairs together, calm, quiet, as though nothing had happened. Robert didn't sleep that night. 3 weeks later, he collapsed at work. A brain aneurysm, the coroner said. Quick and painless. But Margaret told her sister on the phone, he kept saying the ground was talking to him before he died. The long silence Margaret lived on for nearly 2 more decades. She aged quickly, her hair grey by 45, her hands trembling even at rest. But she remained devoted to her children, even as they grew into something she no longer recognized. The basement became their temple. Neighbors heard humming again in the early 80s, low, rhythmic in 3 tones. When asked about it, Margaret only said, "It comforts them." She died in 1991, sitting upright in a chair beside the basement door. The neighbors who found her swore the house was perfectly quiet. But one man claimed he felt a faint vibration under his feet, as if something deep below was still alive, still breathing. The siblings by then, the 3 Parish children, were adults in name only. Thomas died in 2003, aged 52. His body showed abnormal bone density and organ placement. The coroner noted it did not conform to standard human anatomy. Sarah lived until 2017, institutionalized under the name Sarah Preston. Nurses described her as calm, humming constantly, eyes open but unfocused, as if seeing something through time rather than space. Daniel, the youngest, simply disappeared. The official records say he moved away sometime in the late 90s, but Margaret's granddaughter Elizabeth claims otherwise. "He's still here," she told a journalist in 2018. "Not in this house, in this world. You'd know him if you saw him. You'd feel it before you did." The Prestons vanished quietly into history. The house still stands empty and half sunk into the soil, its foundation cracking under decades of neglect. Locals call it the humming place, and when the wind moves just right through the pines of eastern Washington, they say you can still hear it, the faint, steady hum of 3 voices in perfect harmony, echoing the same note that once shook the walls of a Kentucky farmhouse. Time does not bury what refuses to die, and some family histories don't fade, they wait. By the time Elizabeth Preston, born Elizabeth Parish, began tracing her ancestry in 2008, the story of her grandparents' flight from Kentucky had become a whispered fragment, a tale of grief and secrecy. No one in her family spoke the Parish name anymore. But Elizabeth had inherited something stronger than fear, curiosity. It started with a box she found in her mother's attic. The box of silence. It was old, cedar, with brass corners, and wrapped in a sheet marked private. Inside were scraps of paper, faded Polaroids, and one photograph that made her hands tremble. 2 infants lying side by side in a wooden crib. On the back, faint pencil marks, Thomas and Sarah, March 14th, 1951. She had never heard those names. Digging deeper, she found burned fragments of journal pages, Margaret's handwriting. Shaky but legible, they hum when the moon is full. He never cries. He listens. I don't think they're children anymore. Elizabeth sat in silence for nearly an hour, the hum of the refrigerator in her small Seattle kitchen merging with the words in her mind. Something about it felt familiar, not the story itself, but the rhythm of it. Like she had heard it before, the research she began digging, birth records, church registries, census archives. Every trail ended the same way. March 1951, 2 stillbirths recorded under the parish name. No medical details, no follow-ups. She tracked the land deed for the old parish farm in Carter County, Kentucky. It was still there. Unsold for decades, its tax payments handled automatically by a trust with no living administrator. Curiosity became obsession. Elizabeth took leave from work and drove across the country in a rusted Subaru, the photograph of the twins on the passenger seat. When she reached the property, the gate was chained and the air smelled faintly of iron. The farmhouse leaned slightly to one side, Fate's roof collapsing under years of rain and moss. But when she stepped inside, she swore she heard something faint and constant, a low vibration, like an old generator running beneath the floorboards. There was no power. The discovery, she found the first buried object behind the barn, a weathered stone half sunk into the soil. Beneath it, wrapped in decayed canvas, was a piece of wood with smooth edges. It took her hours to realize what it was. Part of a crib rail carved by hand. Over the next 2 days, she found 5 more markers. 6 stones total, exactly as her grandfather Robert had left them. The 6th one was different. Beneath the wrapping lay a small tin box, rusted but sealed tight. Inside were pages from a burned journal and a folded letter addressed to "Whoever still bears our name." The ink had bled with moisture, but one sentence remained legible. "The change is not disease, it is return." The DNA Elizabeth sent saliva samples to 3 separate genealogy services. The results were nearly identical, except for one anomaly flagged as an unclassified sequence. The lab's note read, "Contains gene expressions not consistent with modern human populations. May indicate deep ancestral or non-human variant markers." She called the company. They told her it was likely a testing artifact, a contamination error. But the representative paused before hanging up and said quietly, "I've only seen one other profile like this, also from Kentucky. Same surname, Parish." That was when Elizabeth began to believe. The voices in the months that followed, strange things began happening. Her phone recorded faint humming during the night, even when it was off. Glassware in her apartment trembled during thunderstorms. Once, as she walked home from work, she heard a child's voice behind her whisper, "You found it." She turned, but the street was empty. Her dreams became worse. She saw a crib lit by candlelight, a woman sobbing, 3 figures standing in a circle humming in harmony. When she woke, she could still feel the vibration in her bones. The interviews in 2015, Elizabeth began reaching out to distant cousins through genealogy forums. Most ignored her messages. Some told her to stop digging. One, an elderly man in Ohio, agreed to talk. He told her his grandmother had once mentioned a family curse. She said our blood wasn't clean, he explained. Said it skips generations and comes back meaner. When Elizabeth showed him the photograph of Thomas and Sarah, the man grew pale. "That's them," he whispered. "The twins. My mama said they weren't supposed to be born." That they called to each other from across the fields. He hung up the phone that night and never spoke to her again. The warning: by 2018, Elizabeth had traced more than 30 living descendants of the original Parish family. She contacted each one, emails, letters, phone calls, warning them to watch their children. Most dismissed her as unstable. A few believed her reluctantly. One woman from Oregon wrote back, "My daughter hums in her sleep. Always the same 3 notes. I thought it was cute until I saw her baby brother mouthing the same tune with her." Elizabeth never responded. The Bloodline, in her final recorded interview before going into hiding in 2021, Elizabeth said this, "We thought the family was trying to erase itself. They weren't. They were trying to stop something from finishing what it started. The twins were just the first draft. Daniel was the blueprint. And now it's coming back in us, not all at once, just pieces at a time." When asked what it was, she looked past the camera and said softly, "Whatever was waiting inside the Parish bloodline. It's awake again. The farm today, the old Parish farmhouse, still stands in Carter County. No one has lived there since 1987. Every few years, a new buyer tries to restore it, but they never stay more than a month. Real estate agents say the house smells like metal and medicine no matter how much it's cleaned. Locals say you can still hear humming from the upstairs windows when the wind blows east. 3 notes, perfectly in sync, as if something inside the walls is remembering.